Welcome. Good day, good afternoon, or good evening, wherever you are in the world. I hope life is treating you beautifully. Welcome to Wisdom with Him. I'm your host, Samir, and I look forward to diving deep with you. I know you're going to love this episode. I urge you to listen to this podcast not like any other podcast. I invite you to listen to it from your heart, to listen to it as though it is a conversation between you and your deepest self, to really listen and feel into the words and see what resonates for you and leave what doesn't. I know you're going to receive value from it. I look forward to diving deep with you. Stay tuned and enjoy the episode. I want to take this moment to really acknowledge you because you are right now on a journey that you are choosing yourself. And it's perhaps one of the hardest paths to walk because it's the journey of self-acknowledgement. And if you've experienced a past in where trauma was inflicted upon you, abuse, emotional turmoil, pain, ultimately, you've been probably in a heightened state of survival for most of your life. Even while listening to this right now, whether you realize it or not, many of your habits, personality traits that you identify with as yourself, you may think are you, but in truth, they're the practice pattern of survival. And this is where consciousness really is the gateway to freedom and personal sovereignty. Because through consciousness, we can challenge the thing that we think we are by recognizing the roots of it. And by recognizing the roots of our past pain, our past trauma, we are slowly able to unlearn and undo the power it has in our life. Because no longer does it function from a place of unconsciousness, but rather one of self-awareness. And true conscious awareness on anything is what gives us the ability to make a new choice. So, as many of you are listening to this right now, you've probably already fairly familiar with what are known as the 4 trauma responses. The reason we're going to deep dive on this is because our nervous system, from the time we are born forward, is constantly taking in impressions and sensory input and stimulation through our 5 senses, and is creating imprints and discerning how we should respond appropriately. When you are experiencing situations of heightened stress, threat, danger, or ultimate fear, your body is triggered into an automatic survival response. These are known as the trauma responses. Now, these have evolved over many millennia, and our bodies are highly equipped to adapt and to survive. And when we are in a position where we have the thought that we may be under the effect of some form of harm or threat, we immediately start responding in this activated state. And when we are activated, it's very difficult to have that clarity of mind that we may normally have in a calmer place of functioning. So as we begin to unfold and unravel what these 4 trauma responses are, I want you to take inventory for yourself and notice what resonates, what comes up. You may already have a clear awareness of your own trauma responses, but the reason these are so important to understand is because they are a byproduct of when one doesn't feel safe. And when we have lost our sense of safety, we go into a place of defense and protection. And this can come out in one of 4 ways. The 4 trauma responses are known as the fight response, the flight response, the freeze response, and the fawn response. The fawn response is often known as people pleasing, and we will dive into that deeper as we move through these. The first of them, the fight response. When a child doesn't feel heard, this is when the fight response often gets triggered. When dealing with some form of threat. If a parent is volatile, emotionally volatile, physically abusive, aggressive, verbally abusive, aggressive, whether it's a family member, whether it's a friend or a person in an authority position, when the child experiences the direct impact of feeling unsafe at the cause of somebody else's volatility, their own fight response may be triggered. And when the fight response is triggered, this is a place where, because the child is not being acknowledged, is not being heard, the child is doing what it can to best emote its form of receiving attention. This can be through forms of aggression in yelling, verbal abuse, physically punching holes in the wall, fighting, becoming extremely erratic to the point where they lose all control of their physical body. The reason this is so imperative to understand is when the fight response is activated, the core need that is not being met by that child in that moment is one of not being heard. Now, when we start to recognize the root needs that are not being addressed when these triggered responses get activated, this is how we can begin the process of self-regulation and conscious reparenting. For most of us in our adulthood, we've all experienced moments of outburst, anger, aggression. And if you have or have not, you understand that the reason the anger gets triggered, the emotion of anger, is because you are not being acknowledged and heard in a particular moment. Your viewpoint, your perspective, your feeling, your sense of understanding is not being validated or acknowledged. Take, for example, an individual who comes up into a Starbucks and has their order taken wrong. When that individual is quick to temper, begins berating and yelling at the barista, the person is getting angry and is heightening their voice and trying to what? Be heard. The barista, if they're well trained, will be calm, try to appropriately hear the person out. However, what often happens is, in any situation, whether it's this example or another, when you tell a person who's in a triggered fight response to calm down, to relax, it often has the adverse effect of re-triggering the individual and promoting further aggression, because the individual is not fundamentally being acknowledged. Now, if said barista was to empathize with the individual who is in anger and say, I acknowledge that your order was taken wrong, and I realize that the stress that this has caused, I see that this has been something that we did that has created some form of hesitation, agitation, or stress for you. Let me do something to support this, and I can do it by giving you a free croissant. The whole end for that moment is to acknowledge that the person was, in their experience, not heard. Now, if we take this back to a child, when a child acts out and throws a temper tantrum because their parents are fighting, their parents are telling them to go to bed when they don't want to go to bed, when their parents are potentially experiencing a formal divorce or separation, and the child begins to act out. Acting out is all a cry for attention. And a cry for attention in what form? Acknowledgement. Acknowledgement that the child, their personal point of view, their feelings about a certain situation are not being acknowledged. And when they are not acknowledged, anger, is the emotion that arises to try and create some change. Now, understand when we experience the cycle of three, which is fear, sadness, and anger, often this repetitive loop gets created. We experience fear, which is the emotion that allows us to understand that we have zero control. Fear, when it is induced, we all have a sense of helplessness or complete uncertainty. And this helplessness and this lack of control breeds the second emotion, which is sadness. And the sadness arises as an emotional response to the fear because of the helplessness. The helplessness creates this enduring sadness because of that lack of control. So anger comes in third as a rescuer emotion to provide the sadness some alleviation in the form of some form of conscious control, whether that is destructive in nature. Anger says, I will get something to change, I will get it done. So there is a measure of autonomy felt. So when the fight response is activated, understand that the individual is feeling out of control. They are trying to change their circumstance in whatever way they know how. Oftentimes it's mimicked through the patterns they've observed through parents expressing anger and aggression. And ultimately, if they are fighting, they're fighting because the perceived threat in their experience, the only way to deal with it is through acts of violence, aggression, or anger. And this, again, is a fundamental way of protecting themselves, protecting their own inner child that is not being met in that moment. When parents deny, repress, and ignore how a child is feeling and make them feel unacknowledged, a child will seethe in this anger. If a parent abuses a child physically or verbally, or threatens to abandon said child if they act out, they train the child to begin to repress their emotions in order to gain approval. So understand that the trauma response of fight, when it is activated, it is because the individual sees the only way to fundamentally meet their core need of being heard by raising their own volume, by creating some form of destruction, aggression, chaos, emotion of anger to gain the other person's attention. This is why often you'll notice in certain relationships that become dysfunctional, there is a constant escalation that occurs, especially if both parties are responding with the fight response. And when this escalation occurs from verbal words to physical actions to continuously upping it. And all of this is in turn, unfortunately, not getting to the root that both parties want to experience, which is to be heard. This is why creating a safe space for somebody who is experiencing the fight response is imperative. A safe space where they are mentally, physically, and emotionally safe to express themselves. When an individual is able to express themselves, they are immediately able to regulate the emotions that they are experiencing inside through communication. Without that allowance of conscious communication, the emotion is triggered as a way of being acknowledged. And oftentimes, this in turn, when it doesn't get acknowledged, creates its own cyclical patterns. So this is the first trauma response, known as fight. The second trauma response is known as flight. The flight response is activated when a child initially experiences an overwhelm of sensory input, usually in the form of a person yelling at them, them observing violence. And when a child observes aggression, acts of aggression, violence, especially through their parental figures or family members, the child is often put into a position of flight. And flight looks like I have to get away. And this is, again, a primal response of protection. Getting away is a physical way of trying to avoid potential pain and harm. And flight can look like running away. It can look like hiding in the closet underneath the bed. It can be like going into the bathroom and locking the door. These are all forms of flight. It can be leaving the physical environment in where violence or aggression is activated. But if this is not possible, individuals who respond with the flight trauma response will also check out mentally. This is an example of if an individual is being threatened or abused physically by an individual, if it's a parent, if it's an abuser, this individual, this child usually will say, okay, I can't get away, but I'm going to get away mentally. And in this way, the child dissociates and checks out of their body. They go into their own mental reality, often getting lost in fantasy and their own mental thoughts as a way of disconnecting from the physical reality as a form of flight to protect themselves again in a way of saying, you may hurt me, but you're not going to get me. And this form of trauma response, again, leading into adulthood, can create a variety of issues for the individual who is seeking to have a relationship or is finding themselves unable to maintain focus and a level of concentration on a said task because they find themselves practiced in daydreaming and fantasizing. Often individuals who are practiced in the flight response will often find themselves becoming used to using forms of escapism and addictions as a way of sublimating their primal dissociation with their emotional body. And this is a key understanding for the individuals who deal with the flight response. Their body is no longer a place where they feel safe. And this again leads into our next trauma response, which we are going to discuss, called the freeze response. Now, the freeze response and the flight response are very similar, but the way they are different is in that the freeze response is a result of the nervous system being so overwhelmed and inundated with stimulation, the emotional stressors, and the body's incapacity to process its own emotions, it shuts down. And in shutting down and in freezing, it is again another primal response to protect the individual. In the example of play dead, playing dead is to avoid potential further harm. So if I can hold my breath and freeze, I hope that the person that is threatening me, hurting me, causing me harm will get bored or let me go, or it will hopefully stop adding fuel to the fire that is already existing. So freezing is, again, a form of protection. However, the issue is when the nervous system is overwhelmed and shuts down, most often the individual doesn't know how to return to themselves, return back into their body consciously, and again, creating patterns of dissociation. This leads the individual, especially if it's a child, to often staying isolated and mute within themselves. Most of the time, children who have experienced the freeze response find it very difficult to socialize, to express themselves. The thing with the freeze response is when it is actually activated and a situation arises where an individual is frozen, literally, even if their aggressor is telling them, speak up, say your mind, the individual cannot verbally express, and not one of lack of effort on their part, their actual system won't allow them to open their mouth. And this is the interesting thing, is as this pattern plays itself out into adulthood, you'll see in many situations individuals who deal with the freeze response finding that in circumstances of confrontation, stress, their shutdown response does not allow them their voice, and they become practiced in the repressing of their own emotions, because most of the time their emotions are not ever fully acknowledged or trained for them to learn how to healthily express them. So it takes conscious, again, safety to be created for individuals experiencing the freeze state to feel fully safe from the immediate stress and threat, so that they can actually begin a process of returning to their body through forms of conscious breathing, through forms of shaking and using their physical body. Creating that mind-body connection is imperative, because again, when the freeze response is activated, dissociation is very common. And dissociation means the individual loses their conscious connection between their nervous system and their physical body and their mind. They check out into their mind to the point that their body aptly becomes numb. So any emotional responses that are being engaged, any situations that are triggering within them, rather than processing and relieving themselves of their own natural emotions, these things often just get suppressed and repressed to the point that the individual feels cold, withdrawn, disconnected, and often is seeking some form of satiation from this overall numbness. So you'll find that individuals dealing with the freeze response will often be using some form of substance, some form of addictive tendency as a way of seeking out some form of pleasure. Individuals with the freeze response often are consumed by distraction because they don't know how to regulate their own nervous system, that they spend much of their time in projection, often daydreaming, living in their own mental realities as a way of feeling that they're living their lives while not knowing how to consciously actually create their lives, because their ability to work in congruency with their nervous system so that they can take the necessary actions that they would in their mind can happen. And so again, this is a process of mastering how to create safety for an individual who is used to going into the survival response of freeze. This leads us to the fourth trauma response, and this response is known as fawning or people pleasing. And so when a child experiences the effects of a parent, and in most cases it's a parent that is putting their needs above the child's. Now, this parent may be overtly narcissistic. They may have narcissistic tendencies, or the parent themselves may be themselves emotionally immature to the point that they don't actually know how to acknowledge and deal with their own emotions. And so, again, the child, in turn, in order to protect themselves, so this is a safety mechanism. If a parent is angry, aggressive, violent, volatile emotionally, the child will discern that it is better for me to be on the parent's good side rather than on their bad side, as a way to survive, to protect myself from potential harm. They noticed that potentially their siblings, or that when they did speak out or do what they wanted, they were abruptly dealt with. And in such, they've discerned that the way to survive and manage the chaos is to begin servicing and pleasing the individual who is erratic, dysfunctional, and irresponsible of their own emotions. So this can look like the child beginning to do acts that it naturally wouldn't want to do, but it begins to do as a form of survival. So if the parent is volatile, emotionally escalating constantly, angry, sad, the child will be very cued in, observing the emotional reactions of the parent and learning what to do, what not to do, and learning how to walk and live around this individual. This will look at like the form of the child often listening and being quote unquote really well behaved, being the good boy or the good girl. And again, this parent, if there is siblings, will often favorite and idolize verbally that child in relation to the siblings who may have a different trauma response, like fight, and will place the child on a pedestal. And this also is very detrimental to the child because now they are being praised, they are being given a certain amount of approval, attention, and this is all because they are doing what? They are negating their needs for the sake of the needs of the other, in this case, the parent. And when parents are training their children to suppress their needs for the needs of the parent or the family house unit, they are teaching this child to abandon themselves continuously for the sake of others. And this becomes extremely detrimental in youth and adulthood, as the root of this, again, is the child who is people pleasing is not being seen. And this child, in not being seen, doesn't know how to see itself. Because of the lack of boundaries between the parent and the child, the parent creating the healthy boundaries would look like the parent saying, these are my issues. This is between me and your father. This is not something you need to stress about. You go and do your own thing. You go play. Creating that boundary, that separation that as an adult, I have my own issues. They are not yours to be responsible for. Although you love me and you want to be responsible for me, it is not your job. The child, in turn, would be able to have its own boundaries, its own sense of self. But in a process of dysfunction like this, where codependency develops, codependency being the lack of emotional boundaries between the parent and the child, to the point that the child has to often be in the form of an adult when it isn't. And this in turn creates its own dysfunction. So the people-pleasing tendency is again rooted not in the fact that the child is a good child, that they're kind, that they're loving. It's rooted in a selfish, primal mechanism that is the result of feeling fundamentally unsafe. And that safety is because the individual that they are foregoing themselves for has said they are more important than the child itself. And so this follows forth into youth and adulthood when the child doesn't know how to say no to people, doesn't know how to place healthy boundaries with their self and others. Boundaries can look like not overextending, not having to over listen to somebody, not looking like they have to do continual acts of service to gain a person's approval that otherwise may choose something else. There is a deep connection here between the child not having a conscious sense of self because the child has been forced to abandon their sense of self in order to survive.
And so in relationships in adulthood, often individuals with the people pleasing trauma response will find themselves in toxic relationships where if they attract an individual who mirrors the parental experience they had growing up, their partners will often mimic narcissistic patterns of behavior, or on the higher levels, be a pure narcissist where they actually thrive on having somebody give to them without having any self-awareness of their limit. And the problem is when we have an individual who gives and gives without having healthy boundaries, ends up being that that individual burns out, becomes emotionally exhausted, ends up often living with a heightened level of resentment. There is a deep level of self-doubt and mistrust in themselves because they don't actually know how to consciously trust themselves because they've so used to abandoning themselves. In turn, they don't have an ability to create boundaries. And all of this leads to, again, impacts in relationship and other aspects of their life. Now, the root cause of the fawning trauma response, again, is a protection mechanism. And an example to relay this further would be if you have in a prison system, you have a guard and you have the prisoners. Now, in this case, if one prisoner is isolated by a guard and given extra attention and favor and told, you give me information about the other prisoners and I'll give you extra freedom and protection and you'll be under my wing, that prisoner has to abandon itself in order to maintain its survival and its protection. And in turn, in being favorited by this guard, it's now ostracized by the others who it's actually living with and is in the same realm as. And in turn, it loses that ability for itself to make its own choice, all in turn to put the needs of the selfish guard ahead of it. Now, that little bit of power and protection it gets ultimately means it gives up being able to be relatable, being able to connect, and being able to have some form of normalcy with the other people it's there with, the other prisoners. This is the trap of the people-pleasing pattern, is that you become a slave to other people's wants and needs and opinions and judgments, and there is no garnered internal strong sense of self. And as a result, you end up giving yourself up in situations, doing things you wouldn't want to do, and losing yourself in a variety of ways. And so when we look at the fawning trauma response, the root cause is the child who is left unseen. When we look at the root cause of the freeze response, the root cause is the child who is left unheard. When we look at the root cause of the flight response, the root cause is the child who is left unacknowledged. And again, when we look at the root cause of the fight response, we see that there's the child who is left, again, unheard. Now, as human beings, we all have this root needs, these primary needs to be seen, heard, acknowledged, and fundamentally felt. In this way, we are validated for our experience and we are acknowledged as individuals who are living. When you are stripped of those needs in the form of patterns of abandonment, rejection, abuse, you are ultimately told by those around you that you don't matter. And when this starts and in early childhood, the child begins a practice of believing in their behaviors as ways to survive. And the problem with this, again, is that in adulthood, Often the individual's ego has developed to such a point that they believe this is who they are. This is how they are in the world. This is their personality. And the truth is, all of these patterns are survival responses to stress and to fear and to potential harm. And because they become practice because of situations and life experiences of continued trauma and continued abuse, the individual never gets to reclaim their sense of self. And this is why, again, this is such an important conversation. And this is such an important awareness for you listening. Now, most of us have a combination of one of the four. You may notice that one or two are more dominant, or one specifically is very dominant. And you may notice that you have experiences of all of them. And that's all very normal. What's important is that now that you've heard and been made aware of what these four trauma responses are, you can recognize what your patterns are and what your nervous system is doing to protect you. Again, this is nothing about self-sabotage. This is about self-preservation. Often there's a misconstruing notion that we are self-sabotaging ourselves from good. It's not that. It's that we don't know how to receive the good when you have experienced and endured trauma. So as a form of self-preservation and self-protection, you will repeat what you know how to do to survive. And so as we get ready to move into the next part of the series, take some time after this and journal and write down what became clear for you. Write down which of the four trauma responses you've discovered are most dominant within you, and go through. You may notice that as we've gone through this process, certain memories have been activated. Write those experiences, those significant experiences down that come up. This is a form of clearing and healing. When we bring light to our past and bring light to the situations that we had to face that were beyond our control, we begin to reclaim our sovereignty.
Thank you for joining me on this episode of Wisdom with Him. I'm your host, Samir, and I look forward to seeing you again on the next episode. I hope you received everything you needed from this episode and that it supports you wherever you are in your journey right now. If you did receive some value from this episode, all I'd ask is that you would share this episode with a friend or someone you love so that they too may receive something from it. Thank you for your time, your attention, and your energy. Be well and stay blessed. We'll see you soon.